The official records called them the Rajah's most honored women. This was the language written in palace documents during the 18th and 19th centuries, words chosen to describe what was happening behind high walls in compounds across India. The records praised these women as blessed, chosen, elevated to sacred status within the kingdom. But in 1887, a woman named Savitri managed to escape the palace compound of the Maharaja of Indore. Years later, she gave testimony that directly contradicted everything the official records claimed. She described being locked away at age 12, forbidden from leaving, forbidden from seeing her own family, and subjected to a system so controlling that she eventually forgot what freedom felt like. The palace records never mentioned any of this. They celebrated honor. She described imprisonment. What happened to Savitri was not unique. It was systematic. And it was justified by a structure of law, custom, and power that made the suffering of women inside Raja palaces invisible to the outside world. This is the story of 5 practices that shaped the lives of thousands of women in Indian palace systems. Practices so embedded in the culture that they were considered normal, even honorable. But for the women living them, they were tools of control that destroyed agency, health, and hope. The Raja was not just a ruler. He was positioned as divine, as beyond question, as the center of the kingdom's spiritual and political life. His word was law. His desires were sacred. Administrators obeyed without question. Priests blessed his actions as righteous. Families gave their daughters to him because refusal meant losing status, position, or wealth. Once a woman crossed the threshold into the palace compound, she entered a separate world governed by entirely different rules. The architecture reinforced what law and custom had already begun. The palace compound was designed as a prison that didn't appear to be one. High walls, guarded gates, sealed windows, forbidden chambers. In some compounds, women's quarters were buried in the deepest interior, surrounded by additional walls and locked passages. A woman could be completely enclosed without appearing confined. And then came the most effective tool of all, the language of honor. The women selected for the Raja's household were told they had been chosen for their beauty, their virtue, their suitability to bear his children. They were given titles, fine clothes, jewelry. They received access to luxury that most women in the kingdom would never experience. By the time they understood what the system actually demanded of them, it was too late to resist. Purdah, which means curtain or screen in Urdu and Persian, began as a custom meant to protect women's honor and modesty. By the time it became institutionalized in the Raja palaces, it had transformed into something far more restrictive. The women were not simply required to wear veils in public. Most of them never left the compound, so the veil was irrelevant. Instead, purdah became a system of total isolation. They were separated from male family members who were not their husband. They could not be seen by any man except the Raja himself. They could not speak to servants except through intermediaries. Some Raja compounds took this further. Women could not even see the Raja's brothers, his cousins, or his male administrators. They were locked in their quarters during the day. They could only leave during specific hours, and only within designated areas of the compound. A woman named Maharani Devajyoti of Jaipur wrote a private letter in 1901 that survived in family archives. In it, she described the isolation. "I have been in this compound for 9 years. I have never seen the city beyond these walls. I have seen no male face except my husband's and the servants who are permitted to enter our quarters. My sisters-in-law and I live in adjacent rooms, but can communicate only through written notes. We cannot speak. The sound carries, and it is forbidden." The letter continues. "My daughter was born here. She will grow up here. She will know nothing else. And she too will be told this is honor. The impact on the women was profound and documented. European visitors to the palaces in the 19th century recorded their observations. Lady Baroda wrote in her journal in 1883, "The women of the compound are rarely ill, yet they are perpetually fatigued. They do not move about, they do not engage in labor, yet they seem exhausted by the mere fact of living." I asked the Rajah's physician about this. He said it was natural delicacy. But I believe it is something else, the exhaustion of minds and bodies confined against their will. What purdah created was not just physical confinement. It created psychological imprisonment. The women developed what could only be described as learned helplessness. They stopped expecting to have choices. They stopped imagining futures different from the ones assigned to them. And they internalized the idea that their confinement was their natural state, that the world beyond the walls was dangerous, that their isolation was protection. By the time an opportunity to escape actually arose, many women had lost the ability to imagine escape as possible. But Purdah's cage required locks, and those locks came in the form of marriage itself. In the Rajah palace system, marriage was not a partnership, it was acquisition. The Rajah selected women, sometimes multiple times, with multiple women. There was no consent process that resembled choice. A young woman's family would be approached. Negotiations would happen between male family members and the Rajah's administrators. The woman herself would rarely be consulted. In some cases, women learned they had been married only when they were brought to the palace compound. The legal status of these women was ambiguous and deliberately kept vague. Were they wives? The Rajah might have a principal wife, but many other women in the compound occupied unclear legal positions. Some were officially recognized as secondary wives or concubines. Others existed in a liminal space, not officially married, but claimed by the Rajah as his property. This ambiguity was intentional. If mistreated, they had no legal recourse. Property ownership was forbidden. Their children belonged legally to the Rajah, not to them. If he decided to transfer a woman to another man's household, her voice meant nothing. Historical records from Rajah courts document this casual ownership. In the records of the Rajah of Udaipur, preserved in the Udaipur City Palace archives, there are entries from 1845 that list women by name, age, and status, much like inventory. One entry reads, "Woman named Lakshmi, age 16, brought from Jodhpur household, assigned to secondary quarters. Health assessed as adequate for breeding purposes." The language is clinical. The woman is not described as a person. She is described as property being inventoried. The moment a woman entered the Rajah's household, her previous identity was erased. She received a new name, often a name chosen by the Rajah himself. Her family connections were severed, not officially, but practically. She could not leave the compound to visit her family. She could not receive visitors from her former life. She was given no information about what was happening to her family or her village. Some women never learned whether their parents were still alive. In effect, the woman they had been before the palace was dead, and nothing could resurrect her. One of the most systematic and brutal aspects of the Rajah palace system was the practice of marrying girls while they were still children. These were not marriages in any meaningful sense. They were arrangements that placed children in circumstances far beyond their capacity to endure. The practice was justified by custom, by religion, by the need to form political alliances. But the consequences for these girls were severe. Girls as young as 8, 9, and 10 years old were brought into these arrangements with men sometimes 30, 40, or 50 years their senior. The girls were placed in situations they could not survive unchanged. Historical records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal the reality behind the official celebration of these alliances. Documentation from that era reveals a pattern. Many children in these arrangements experience serious health crises. Mortality rates among child brides were significantly higher than the general population. The official records rarely acknowledged this. Instead, deaths were attributed to common illness. But the evidence, found in scattered notes, family records, and testimony that survived, tells a different story about what these children endured. These records were filed away in palace archives, not published, not discussed, not acknowledged. The Rajah's official court records simply noted that the girl had died of illness. But the physician's notes, discovered only in the 20th century when archives were opened, documented the reality. The girl's body was not developed enough for what was being done to her. The injuries were catastrophic. The infection was predictable. And yet, the practice continued. A testimony from a woman named Priya, recorded by a British administrator in 1891, described her experience of being married at age 10 to a Rajah 3 times her age. "I did not understand what marriage was. I thought I was going to live in a beautiful house. I was brought into a situation I could not comprehend. I knew nothing of what would be expected of me. I could not refuse. I thought this was something all wives had to accept." Years into her testimony, when asked about her life after marriage, Priya spoke of the physical toll her youth had taken. She spoke of experiences that came too early, of a body and mind that were not ready for what was demanded of them. What emerges from her account is the reality that childhood was stolen. Her future was determined before she understood what futures were possible. The long-term consequences for child brides were devastating. Their bodies were damaged before they fully matured. Their physical development was interrupted. Their ability to have healthy pregnancies later was often compromised. But beyond the physical effects were the psychological ones. Girls who had been treated as property, who had been subjected to circumstances far beyond their capacity to understand or consent to, who had no one to protect them or acknowledge what was happening, developed patterns of learned submission that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They had been broken before they had a chance to become whole. What followed was not healing, but escalation. Once a woman was inside the palace compound, her body became the property of the system in a specific way. She was valued for her ability to produce heirs. The Rajah needed legitimate sons to ensure the succession. The need for heirs created a system where a woman's worth was entirely determined by her fertility. She was expected to become pregnant regularly. If she did not, she was blamed. If she could not conceive after a certain period, she was sometimes discarded or demoted in status. The medical realities of this pressure were significant. Women were pushed to become pregnant repeatedly, year after year. Many of them, especially those who had been child brides, had bodies that were not yet fully mature. This constant cycle took a devastating biological toll. Records from palace physicians document a pattern. Women's health deteriorated with each successive pregnancy. One physician's log from 1878 documented a woman named Malini across multiple years. Her health declined progressively, her complications increased, until eventually the records simply ended. What these patterns reveal is systematic harm, the slow destruction of women's bodies through forced, repeated pregnancies. This was not random cruelty, it was deliberate architecture. Some Rajah compounds employed midwives and physicians whose specific role was to maintain constant pregnancy and prevent any resistance through fertility control. If a woman miscarried, she would be blamed for weakness and expected to conceive again immediately. If she gave birth, minimal recovery time passed before pressure for the next pregnancy began. If a woman attempted to use any method to avoid pregnancy, she faced punishment. The body was the instrument of the system, and the system never rested. The children born to these women had uncertain fates. Sons were claimed by the Rajah and raised in the palace. Daughters were either kept or given away to other palace compounds, continuing the cycle. If a woman gave birth to a daughter when a son was needed, the disappointment and resentment she faced from the Rajah and his household was severe. Some women described being withdrawn from favor, their rations reduced, their treatment becoming cold, simply because they had failed to produce sons. Beyond the physical pregnancies were the psychological consequences of being treated as a vessel, as a breeding mechanism. Women were not consulted about whether they wanted children. They had no agency in deciding when to have them, how many to have, or what would happen to them. A woman's identity became entirely subsumed into her reproductive function. She ceased to be a person and became instead a tool for continuing the Rajah's line. When a Rajah died, his widow faced a choice that was not actually a choice. The practice of sati, a widow burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre, was technically voluntary. But the pressure, the expectation, the social machinery built to push widows toward this choice was immense. A widow who did not perform sati faced a fate that was, in many ways, worse than death. She would be stripped of her status. She would be confined even more strictly than before. She would be treated as inauspicious, as bringing bad luck to the household. She would live as a ghost within the palace, confined, unsupported, and invisible. The records of Rajah courts document this explicitly. In the annals of the Rajah of Jaipur, there is an entry from 1823. On the death of Maharaja Prithvi Singh, his primary wife, the Maharani, performed sati. His secondary wife and concubine, who refused to perform sati, has been moved to the widow's quarters. She is forbidden from speaking to other members of the household. Her rations have been reduced to the minimum required to sustain life. She is not permitted to leave her chambers. This is customary and appropriate. The widow's quarters in many Rajah palaces were literally cells, small rooms with minimal light, minimal resources, and strict guards. A widow who had survived her husband faced decades of confinement as punishment for surviving. Some widows were kept in these quarters for 40, 50, even 60 years. They aged in isolation. They developed physical ailments from the lack of sunlight and movement. They died in these rooms and were discovered only when their bodies began to decompose. There was no one to care for them. There was no one to mark their passing. The cruelty of the widow's fate was that it denied women even the dignity of choosing death. A widow who wanted to perform sati, who wanted to escape the isolation and degradation of the widow's quarters, was given that escape route. But a widow who wanted to live faced a punishment so severe that death seemed merciful. In this way, the system made widows disappear either way, through sati or through slow erasure in isolation. The Rajah's household was either rid of them through death or rid of them through their effective removal from human society. What all 5 of these practices had in common was that they were designed not just to control women's bodies, but to destroy their sense of self. A woman who entered the Rajah's household entered a system that systematically dismantled her identity. She lost her name, her family connections, her autonomy, her bodily integrity, her agency over reproduction, and in many cases, her future. What remained was not a woman, but a shell, an entity shaped entirely by the desires and needs of the Rajah and his system. Former residents of these palaces, who were interviewed decades later, described a specific psychological state that developed over time. They described no longer knowing their own preferences. They could not make a choice without imagining what the Rajah would want. They had internalized such complete submission that autonomy felt foreign. One woman, who escaped at age 32 after spending 20 years in a Rajah's household, described the moment of freedom. "I stood outside the walls and did not know what to do. I could not decide what direction to walk. I could not decide whether I was hungry. I could not remember my own name from before." The system was designed this way intentionally. A woman who retained her sense of self, her autonomy, her hope for escape, would be dangerous to the system. A woman who had been broken, who had internalized her captivity as inevitable, who had lost the ability to imagine freedom, that woman would not rebel. That woman could be contained with minimal force. The guards and the walls were less important than the psychological destruction that made walls seem necessary. The British colonial administration, which arrived in India in the late 18th and 19th centuries, eventually banned many of the practices that had characterized the Rajah palace systems. Sati was officially abolished in 1829. Child marriage was progressively restricted through colonial law. Purdah was not legally abolished, but British administrators began documenting and exposing what happened inside palace compounds. For the first time, official attention was turned toward the women trapped inside. But when the Rajah palaces began to empty, when women were released or when compounds were dismantled, something unexpected happened. Many women could not reintegrate into society. The decades inside had changed them beyond recognition. Some had lost the ability to function independently. Some had no family waiting for them. Their relatives had died or disowned them as dishonored. Some could not physically tolerate the outside world after years of sealed chambers. Society rejected them as used, as damaged goods, as women who had been in a Rajah's household and could therefore never be respectable. For those who managed to leave, the options were grim: asylums, charitable homes, convents. The records are sparse, but the pattern is clear. Women entered these institutions and disappeared from history again. What happened to them after is not documented. They fade from sight twice, once when the palace doors closed behind them, and again when they left. But what is undeniable is this: freedom was not salvation. The damage was irreversible. Their identities were erased. Their sense of self had been systematically destroyed. Their sense of agency was gone. Most women could never fully grasp what freedom actually meant. The Rajah palaces themselves were preserved as historical monuments. Tourists visit them today and marvel at the architecture, the gardens, the opulence. The guides describe the history of the Rajahs and their kingdoms, but they rarely mention the women who lived inside those walls. They rarely discuss what happened in the quarters that are now displayed as museum exhibits. The palaces stand as beautiful structures, cleaned up and preserved, while the suffering they contained is erased from the narrative. The laws have changed. Sati is illegal. Child marriage is illegal in India. Purdah is not mandated by law, but legislation does not kill systems. It just forces them to wear different clothes. Control doesn't disappear. It adapts. It finds new language, new justifications. The genius of the Rajah palace system was that it understood something crucial. Control is most effective when clothed in honor. The women were told they were blessed. Their confinement was protection. Their lack of choice was tradition. Their suffering was love. Listen to these words today. Women are still told that restrictions placed on them are for their own good, that their role is to bear children and serve the family, that their value is determined by their fertility, that their worth is tied to obedience and purity. The specific palace may be gone. The machinery remains. Marriage without choice still exists. Families still control women's bodies. Women are still told their bodies belong to someone else. Women still leave and are treated as dishonored, as shameful, as deserving to be cast out. The compounds have different names now, but the cage is recognizable to anyone who has lived inside one. This is not just history, it is a mirror. The story of Rajah palaces shows what happens when an entire system is built to convince women they have no choice, no value, no future except the one assigned to them. When oppression is systematic enough, when it is justified by enough tradition and law and culture, it becomes invisible to everyone except those experiencing it. And by the time the outside world sees it, the damage may be irreversible. The women who lived in Rajah palaces left few records. Their names are forgotten. Their suffering was not written in the official histories. But they were there. What happened to them mattered. Their stories are testimony to what is possible when power is absolute and resistance is impossible. They are a warning that such systems do not dissolve on their own. They must be seen, they must be named, and they must never take root again. The palace walls still stand. The compounds are still visible. The architecture survives, preserved as monuments to empire. But the women who lived inside them are gone. What remains is silence. And in that silence, we hear everything.